Hi, I'm Jesse Hirsh, and welcome to another episode of MetaViews. Coming to you live from the Academy of the Impossible, where the goats are running to see if they can find a seat, but there are no seats. And today we've got my great friend Tamika, where we're gonna maybe talk about dialing an ancestor. This is where I have to tell you, Tamika, we have a very spontaneous show to the way in which we evolve. And every episode is kind of an iteration of the entire show, as it were. And we're now in a kind of game show mode, which, before we begin, to give you a heads up, I tend to pick three pillars that I frame the conversation around. In your case, I've chosen anthropology, America, and ancestors, partly because I'm a big fan of alliteration, so once I get going on a few letters, it's hard to stop. But we do practice spontaneous conversation here, so I have no idea where we are going to go with today's chat. But we do have segments, and we start every MetaViews episode with the news, partly because we publish a daily newsletter on Substack called The Future of Authority. Today's issue looks at the perils of automated justice, which is really about corruption and a false accusation being scaled up to the level of an automated system, which is rather dystopian. But Tamika, the real purpose of every news segment is actually to throw to our guest. And this is meant to be an intuitive exercise where whether it's personal news, whether it's world news, whether it's industry news, we're really asking our guests, what are you paying attention to these days? But more importantly, what do you think our audience should be paying attention to? And this is where it is kind of a game show segment, because we did have a guest who didn't make it past the news segment. And I mention this because it is currently our most popular episode. So there is a little bit of pass-fail to this, no pressure. But what is it? What are you looking at these days? And again, what do you think our audience should be looking at these days?
Okay. Firstly, lovely to be here, and this does feel like a genuine conversation that we have pretty often. So it's lovely being here. This is okay. The thing that I am partially obsessed with at the moment is a booklet from the predecessor of the CIA's strategic services pamphlet. And part of it, if I remember correctly, this was for managers and kind of operations. It was about what to do to very simply sabotage organizing work. And when I read it, a friend sent it to me. I don't know where they got it from, but a friend sent it to me. And as soon as I read these simple steps for sabotaging organizations, I was like, oh, shit. This is what corporate America, whatever, we do to ourselves over and over again. It's become it's almost read like a playbook for the way that work should be done, and it's simple things such as referring back to decisions that have already been made, or questioning the lexicon and the language of every single element of the meeting or the conversation, or things that make sure that there are at least 7 people in a meeting at any one time and have no idea what the kind of dynamics or power structures or decision making is. So I read it, and I think it's from the 60s. I might be lying, can't remember.
It might be 50s even.
Maybe. Why'd you say that though?
Well, because the Office of Strategic Services, which was the predecessor to the CIA, its heyday was in the 40s and 50s. That's when it was really ripping and roaring, before they kind of tamed it to become the CIA, because the CIA was the more institutionalized version of the OSS as more of a motley crew of ne'er-do-wells and schemers who was the post-World War II intelligence apparatus of the U.S.
This makes a lot of sense. So I saw this and I was like, oh, wow, how much of our kind of like David Graeber-esque bullshit jobs, right? It's like, wow, this has become like a mass way to control our time and our sense of worth and our value. And I think I'm thinking about this a lot at the moment, particularly because I am observing Ramadan. So I'm not Muslim, but I think as a spiritual practice, it is there's a lot of like potential and possibility there. So I'm really thinking about the way that I manage my time and my energy at the moment. So kind of reading this as of late, I'm very sensitive to it at the moment. I've also just watched the soundtrack to a coup d'etat. Have you heard of it?
No, 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 no.
It's okay. So it is about the assassination of Patrice Lumumba and the
Yeah.
part that the CIA played in it when it came to kind of like the struggle for Africa and this kind of like pan-Africanism movement that came from, you know, the early 60s. And it's about America's role in using what I would consider cultural and artistic strategy as a political strategy. So basically, Louis Armstrong was used as a puppeteer to kind of distract from this thing that was happening in sub-Saharan Africa.
Right on. A few quick responses before I go to our
Yeah.
next segment. To your point, I love to point out to people that the core element of fascism is the corporation and corporate control. That we are so used to thinking of authoritarianism as like the Soviet kind, that there's this big apparatus of the state. But fascism's mechanism of authoritarianism is the corporation, is the corporate workforce. And I think that's part of why America has slipped into this so easily and so rapidly. I do, when we get into anthropology, want to hear more about your Ramadan experience, because I think that's absolutely brilliant. But I do want to share my own thoughts around work lately, in that I love my dogs. I spend most of my time around my dogs. And I've been trying to articulate a dog philosophy of work, which is on the one hand very committed. Like, you love your job, you want to do your job, but A, you do it on your terms. B, sleeping on the job is a prerequisite. And like, it is entirely done with your character, your style. You poop, you pee, when and where you want. But there is still that commitment to the job. There is still that like that ethic of work in which it's on your terms. It's not lazy, but it's restful. Yet it is still fundamentally productive. They still get the job done, like all the time, 10 out of 10. So still in my formation stage, but I like this idea that we need to radically rethink the culture of work and come at it free from the corruption of corporate culture and the way in which it's tainted it, especially in our contemporary moment. But on that point, I segment to our second element of MetaViews, which is our WTF, or what's the future? And this is where, you know, again, we have to center ourselves as a future-centric podcast. And we believe in participatory futurism, where every guest who comes on our episode is a kind of futurist. But of course, in your case, Tamika, you are a veteran, a futurist. You've rolled with some of the most exciting, interesting futurists, I think, out there. No pressure. But the question really, like the first one, is what's on your event horizon? Like, when you look into the future, and it could be short term, could be long term, could be fictional, could be personal. It's up to you. But what do you think our audience should be looking at? What do you think they should be seeing in our collective sense of if there's nothing inevitable, provided we're willing to pay attention?
I love that. I love that. The first time that I started really understanding a futurism as like a discipline or an element, I don't know who to attribute this to, but the futures here, it's not very evenly distributed. I don't know who that comes from, has stuck in my mind, but that is a close second. I think this idea of like mimetic culture is really interesting. I've got recency bias because I listened to the creator of an Instagram account called Nolita Dirtbag speak yesterday at an event, and his event was titled kind of cultural anthropology, which was the hook in, but it was mainly about like the behavior that he's observed within a very small area of the Lower East Side in New York City. And he's got like, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of followers. Not that that means anything to me. Big data right now, very little context and sensitivity. So I hope that the future has more kind of people that anthropology has a lot to answer for as like a history. And I think it is a discipline that is really scared of its own potential, so plays small and to the edges quite a bit, understandably, because we see race and class and power dynamics and in absolutely everything. So I think anthropologists often like ask the right questions but then are scared to move into kind of like action. But anyway, mimetic culture, he was talking mainly about the memes that kind of like pop off and go viral. But I think this idea of kind of like absorbing and co-opting and having a looser relationship with ownership, I think is one of the glances into the future, at least like the glances of into the future of the people that I spend a lot of my time and life with. I think there's a move away from this kind of constipated idea of like having to hold on very closely and like own your ideas.
And constipation is such a great way of framing it. Please continue.
Like, girl, why are you so constipated? Like, do you not believe in your source? Like, you're gonna generate so many more ideas and thoughts if you continue to pay attention. Like, I really believe in you. Why do you not believe in you? You know? So I hope.
But not just to tease it out, because I love toilet humor. Like, we shit all the time. And if you don't shit, that's really unhealthy. Like, if you hold it in, you are going to have so many medical complications. So shit and move on, right? Keep creating, keep moving forward. I love the power of that imagery.
I love the power of the imagery of shitting. Same, but I think it really does work. But I hope that that is one element of the future. And I think this is kind of like with the downfall of cryptocurrencies, or like, you know, people kind of being taken in by snake oil salesmen. I hope, and I've always got a hopeful view of the future. I think you have to. If you're going to be alive, like, find the pockets, find the people, find the patterns and the blueprints that at least are a shade of the future that you want to see, and like keep working like within them. So yeah, I'm hoping this like constipated ownership moves into a more participatory and like mimetic way of being, which I think the internet and like the tools that we have kind of help facilitate. And that's part of Dial-an-Ancestor. I say it all the time. I'm like, open source, babe, like icons, ways of working, blueprints. Like, I will give you everything that I know. I want it to be co-opted and appropriated over and over again, because it's not come from me. I am not the purveyor of this like idea or this baby movement in any way, shape or form. The people that came with John Giorno had Dial a Poem in the 1960s, and it's really funny. He had a recent MoMA show that exhibited his work from the late 60s, and it's called Dial a Poem. It is a bunch of phones, and he very carefully curated the people that he got to say poems exclusively on this kind of public telephone network. And it was on at the MoMA in New York for a little while. And I had so many texts from people being like, Tamika, this person's stolen your idea. It's Dial a Poem. And the amount of times that I'm like, no, this is from the 1960s. This guy did this ages ago. I didn't realize, but like when Dial-an-Ancestor came out, I was like, oh my God, there's someone that is like literally done this thing before. And my response to it isn't like, oh no, I am the owner of Dial-an-Ancestor. It's not mine. It's actually ours and has come from a lineage of people who have done so much thinking and making and doing and experimenting beforehand. So the amount of texts have been like, this person's stolen your thing. I'm like, no, actually, if anything, I stole his thing, you know? But the difference between it is I'm asking anyone who stumbles across it to see this existential trigger, usually like a wheat pasted poster that is an invitation to ask people to consider their life, who they are, and that ancestry happens in the present rather than the past. And actually, it's a public service telephone line, not unlike John's, but actually that's more participatory and democratic. So I'm like, yeah, same, kind of, but actually the philosophy of it, I think, is really different. And it's just
and that's where, before we segue to digging into the anthropology, I would point out that in addition to being a cultural anthropologist, you're clearly I'm trying to mesh these two words in a way that I probably will mangle the first time, but the philosopher provocateur, because you're trying to provoke philosophy, right? You're not claiming to be a philosopher who has the answers, but you're also not the anthropologist who's kind of leaning back, in the sense you're trying to provoke thinking. You're trying to provoke reflection. You're trying to provoke, because your valid criticism or comment about anthropology is not just about anthropologists. It's about all researchers and academics, that they, as I think a very prejudicial bias, think that they shouldn't be participating in the research that they're in. And that is wrong. That is morally wrong. But to the concern where anthropology has been a force of terror in the past, I think the counter to that is nuance. Right? I think the more nuance that is brought to research, to anthropology, to a researcher's life, and that could be humility of, as the researcher, here's where I'm coming from. Here's my position. Here's my perspective. I think that nuance insulates against some of the abuse that a researcher can be in a position to engage in because of the power that comes from research, from thinking. And that's where, to my point, that as the philosopher provocateur, you are trying to get people to be powerful. You are trying to get people to participate. You feel a sense of responsibility because you know the power of the researcher. So you're saying to the people who are there, hey, come on, take some of this power, will you? Exercise some of this power, will you? As an invitation.
Jesse, I love, as an invitation, I love that so much. I remember when you were asking me about my citizenship and where I saw my home a few years ago. And I was trying to explain why, like, America just, in spite of it all, and in spite of, like, I grew up in a very, like, radical socialist, like, environment. That's just, that those are my people. That's my lineage, especially on my mum's side. Sometimes to our detriment, we're very working class and have been out of work and like banned from workplaces for like
causing shit
a lot of our time. Exactly, causing shit. So it doesn't always work out, and that's like it's sexy to be like, oh, like saboteur, like, do you know what I mean? Like that's what we've been talking about this whole time, and sometimes it has real fucking consequences. But I love yes, this idea of like trickster energy. So my dad's Ghanaian, and I remember being like 6 or 7 years old and freaking my mum the fuck out because my granddad he died before I was alive. And I remember telling my mum, like, after I woke up one night, that I'd learned all these stories about like a spider, and he was a really naughty spider. He did this, that, and the other. And I remember her face just going like white. And she was like, what are you talking about? And she made me explain it more and tell the story. And it was the stories of like Anansi the spider, who had that trickster kind of energy, who was just kind of like highlighting what is actually happening here. And I think you make such an excellent point, because as a researcher, working with people that sometimes lead the research and are trying to like beat this idea of neutrality into you, it's like insanity. Yeah. Like none of us none of us are neutral. Like, state your positionality and your bias. Like, that feels the more responsible thing.
And I'll go further. And when these words come out of my mouth, it's different when then they come out of other people's mouths. So I have a different privilege when I call people on this. But when researchers in particular try to assert neutrality, that is colonization.
Exactly.
Like, they are literally engaged in the colonization of knowledge, which makes anthropology so dangerous, because you must have that positionality. You must have that
100%.
ethics, that perspective, that who you are in all fields, not just anthropology. This is true in fucking computer science as much as it's true in anything. But the quick pushback to that is no. This, we have to be doing this by rejecting neutrality. Otherwise, our work is problematic. It's tainted. It's ethically immoral. Again, different people saying that has different effect, right? And that's one of the privileges I can have, because I also have the language of academia. I know how to use their words in a way that they don't think I'm an outsider, even though I am. And so it's a paradox. But before I move on to our feature conversation, I want to, you inspired me with something else that I want to try to articulate, which is, imagine if there were, for lack of a better phrase, a vanguard, but vanguard's not the right word. Imagine if there was a movement, a hip group of creators, diverse creators in the sense of musicians, artists, playwrights, actors, like all the talent, who were making a move in industry, and they all rejected copyright. They all said, everything we are creating individually and together, go remix it, go share it, go pirate it, go sell it if you want to. And they said the reason we're doing this is A, we've achieved a level of success where we're eating well, and B, what we are interested in developing professionally is our reputation. And we want to do this work because we believe that our reputation is what we can retire on. Our reputation is what will give us the stability of a career and the diversity of opportunities, right? And we're doing it together to make a movement. Fuck you, copyright. Fuck you, constipation. We're doing this for culture. Again, with your future lens, am I being crazy here, or is this something that we could anticipate happening?
I think it is happening. You've reminded me of Mischief. I think they are very, very interesting. I listened to a lawyer from the Mischief crew talk about the amount of cease and desists that they've kind of received in the last few years, because they take this philosophy of like, everything's everyone's anyway. And I know that there's like some, light and shadow sides to that as well. But let's talk about the light side for now. And all these cease and desists that have come from corporate institutions that have billions of friggin' like surplus dollars that are talking to these like bunch of like 6, 7 like art collective kids. And I know they're not kids, they're like adults, but I say that with reverence.
Youthful energy.
Exactly. I am going to be a kid until the day that I die. With those cease and desist letters, it's like you can do 3 things for real. You can like hire a lawyer to get back at the big corporate like evil entity. You can ignore it, or thirdly, you can take whatever the cease and desist is and turn it into a like embrace and play, How about I challenge you as a corporate company, instead of like coming for my neck, please, I beg of you, like here's some things of ours, like feel free to like embrace and remix that. Like imagine if cease and desist turned into like the inverse, which is like the basis of your copyright idea, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah. And to some extent, the precedent here is the Streisand effect, right?
What's that?
The Streisand effect in kind of internet lore is, I forget when this, it was like maybe a decade and a half ago, someone uploaded a photo of Barbara Streisand's house on the internet. And she got a cease and desist saying, you can't have that, blah, 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 blah. And then everybody started uploading the photo everywhere on the internet. right? To your point, it was the opposite of the cease and desist. They're like, oh, somebody wants to censor this information? Okay, we're going to use the internet to spread this information far and wide. Fuck you, copyright. And the Streisand effect for a while was this phenomena that if lawyers overstepped, if a corporation overstepped, there was a culture of defiance that would completely disrespect that. The reason I think that cultural practice has radically diminished is automatic copyright enforcement. That most platforms, algorithms control what is permissible, and so you get the copyright strike. They automatically remove it. It's a cat and mouse game, and TikTok is the best example of where the mouse is always ahead. Like, there is always pirated content on TikTok. There's always people ripping off, but you have to be clever, and you have to evolve, and you have it's a game, and it's a constant back and forth. So it's interesting. I mean, I am going to press the button that brings us to the feature part of every part of MetaViews, where ostensibly we get into the Anthropology, America, and Ancestors. But in our usual nonlinear fashion, we've been doing that already. But allow me to refocus it back on anthropology, because as we've been talking so far, the thought that came to me was thinking about our last several conversations and kind of how I'm sensing an evolution in your perspective on anthropology. And not just an evolution, I feel almost that you are appropriating it in a really powerful way and fitting it to your own kind of political economic worldview. That may be entirely unconscious on your part, but I am. Let's start by saying, well, what is your current view or your current revolving relationship with anthropology? Because it seems to be becoming a really excellent source of power, and I'm curious if you feel the same way.
That's really interesting. I feel more, you use the word power very often and very explicitly in ways that even in the last few years has made me kind of question why I'm not. And again, this is back to our America question, but it's also so inextricably linked with the anthropological practice that I'm like in right now. So I've sponsored myself to be in America under the guise of being a cultural and corporate anthropologist. And here's the thing, I use titles very loosely, as and when they make sense to me, to be in the position or in the place that I need to be to do the work that I need to do. So I'm not entirely like wedded to it. However, I think through understanding the history of anthropology and where it's come from, I can see all of this like beautiful generative source material that's been like used in, at least from my point of view, in a very dangerous, vitriolic and extractive way that didn't need to happen. And I kind of think everyone who's paying attention, just like in a semblance of a way, is a cultural anthropologist anyway. But I've started playing with the title and seeing how people kind of react to it. And it's fascinating because it does give me power. Yeah. People are like, wow, you know? And I'm like, I don't think it's that. I wanted to go to school to go and do a social anthropology course. I did like a 6-month course at Goldsmiths. And an old client was like, Tamika, since the age of 19, you've been traveling around the globe, like asking people a bunch of questions about a bunch of things. Like, what are you going to try and get into debt for? Like, that makes no sense. So instead, I just tried on the title and saw what kind of happens. And the thing is, it repels some people who I'm working with in cultural and corporate spaces, which is fantastic. Love that. Baby, I'm not a strategist. Your frameworks are not going to save you. I do not trust any strategist, researcher, insights person that has that skill set and doesn't use it for like, if you're not using it for commercial gain, then I just don't really trust you, to be perfectly honest. It's such low-hanging fruit. You can use this in so many different ways. Like, I don't
to our point, with great power comes great responsibility, and you have to distrust anyone who seeks the power and eschews the responsibility. And that is
This is
very
it.
much the corporate world for most people in it. And for legitimate reasons. If it's just your job, I get why you're taking this mercenary approach, but maybe you should quit the job.
The mercenary approach is so interesting. Going back to the film A Coup d'etat, so it's about 2 hours. It's really, really beautifully done. I really recommend it. There was a tiny scene in which the mercenaries were in it for about 60 seconds, and that was a gut punch for me of being like, I never in my corporate life want to be a mercenary who dehumanizes, moves for like monetary gain only, and then doesn't really know the war that they're fighting. Like, what war are you fighting? How are you being used and abused? Like, there's got to be a spiritual and psychic death there.
Agreed, but allow me to indulge in the kind of conversations we have and flip that. What about a mercenary who starts from the position that they understand the war, they understand the battle, and it's the
100%.
organization and the institution who doesn't? And the organization and the institution is engaged in the dehumanization. And the mercenary is brought in to humanize. And in by humanizing helps them survive the battle, helps them not win the war, because no war is winnable, but maybe helps them recognize how the hell they need to reorient themselves and their organization accordingly.
1,000%. So the words that I love that at the moment is that I'm a professional trespasser. I've found myself like that's what I do. That's what I do for a living. I'm like, how am I here? How did I get here? What's going on? Why are they listening to me? But to be in, and it's quite easy for me to do. I think I've had the privilege and the luxury of mixed race background, mixed culture background, mixed languages, mixed ways of doing. Like, I've had the luxury of like growing up very working class, going to.
Let me take one step back and make a comment about your choice of title, because this goes to my point about the philosopher provocateur. You want to take a title, because I think I identified with you when you said this. You want to take a title that is inclusive, that anyone else can take. But then you want to demonstrate a different way of being that title. And so this is where you leverage your position on the periphery, because you are an outlier. Right? Fundamentally, you're always kind of on the outside, but you have the power and confidence to be like, no, and there's value in that. Right? And that is a major differentiator between everyone else on the periphery and the outlier who are feeling guilty or ashamed or alienated or excluded. And perhaps because of your parents, because this is true in my case, and it was my parents, who made me feel, no fucking A, better to be on the periphery. You have way more autonomy, way more fun. And that's where I think the professional trespasser is a brilliant synthesis of those dynamics while still emphasizing the value and the power that you bring to the client, that you bring to the organization.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that like summary. It really makes me like feel, thank you like for seeing it and seeing me. I really, really appreciate like the name of Corner Booth for that reason. Where like being on the edge or on the periphery, like you decide where the center is. The center's absolutely everywhere. You call it. And that's like the part of the positionality of like naming who you are and where you're seeing from. But the reason that I do that is because there's no designated seating in a corner booth. Like, damn it, let's all get in if it makes sense for us to get in right now. And if it doesn't, maybe I leave for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, a couple of years, and like you'll run it. But from the corner, I mean, it's the best seating ever. Like you get to see what's going on in the outside world. You get to see the like social fabric and the contracts that we're all constantly creating for ourselves and each other. You get to peer behind the scenes and see the way that like the chef is operating with their team. Like you understand, like we live in a very big data world, but very low context, and professional trespassing is all about gathering the context, and it's the context that makes people feel like uncomfortable a lot of the time, and the contradictions and the nuances, and we're all in it like late stage capitalism. There's no getting out of it. Like,
well, and to your point, context makes us aware of danger. And most people prefer to be oblivious of danger, especially in the corporate context, especially in contemporary America. I did the last episode of MetaViews was with this guy, Ted Whetstone. And he had a vision of leadership in which, as a leader, you don't expect people to follow you. As a leader, your job is to make other people leaders, to empower them to be leaders. And the problem he's trying to present, which I think you are also in context addressing, is complexity. That the consequence of the big data world is you get a lot of complexity, and context is the solution. Context is how you understand complexity. Context is how you figure out what part of the complexity to deal with, right? In your own little day, in your own little role. And I was joking with him that is entirely foreign to organizational culture as we know it. So that really leads me to my question, still within our anthropology context. To what extent are you probing and engaging with organizational culture? And to what extent is the organization open to that?
Oh my God, this is such a good question. This is it. This is what I'm going through right now. So the best work will come from me having a period of time in the process that is just context gathering. That's what I call it, stage 0. You got to let me hang out. You have to let me hang out. It feels like when it does work, there is a leader who knows that, like, for lack of a better word, something's off. They're using their spidey senses and they're like, something's a bit off here. Or they will very easily. So I just before this was on a call with a creative director who's just been brought into a company that I'm working with. And I don't usually work with the board, but I'm working with the board where I'm like, oh my God, my eyes are opening. The way that decisions like truly get made. And that is
where you need to be trespassing. Like a trespasser doesn't just loiter in the lunchroom. You got to go to where the goods are. You got to go to where the money's hidden. Anyway, please continue.
I am going to where the money is hidden. I was so naive, and I got into that boardroom, and there's certain boardrooms that feel very different compared to corporate culture. Anyway, a creative director has just been put into this role, and this was the Zoom that I was on before this, and apologized. We've met twice in the last week, and has apologized for using it as a therapy session. And I had to stop her. I was like, you do realize that this is like the majority of my job. Like, you are giving me all of the information that I need to be able to work in partnership with you to create a solution that like genuinely works. And, we're talking about everything from like style and fashion and money and the way that people spend their time and race and like this is a fashion brand, but we need to talk about all of these things from an inside purview, what is happening like inside the company, and then what's happening on the outside world, and like where those golden threads and contradictions and tensions are. But that's my like dream client, someone who just is like, I'm so sorry, I probably should send you an NDA. Otherwise, like, there's no point of me being here,
And allow me to try to phrase this as a question, although I may fail in doing. The therapy piece, I think, is really interesting because I think on a generalized level, all consulting is a form of therapy. And the best consultants understand that and know how to make that part of their business offering, of their like productization. But I wish we didn't have to be so coy about it. I wish we could be more open and transparent that is exactly the value of the consultant. The therapist is someone who is not your spouse, who you can spill all your shit to. And as a professional, they're there to advocate for you, to help you process your emotions. I wish that we as consultants, as trespassers, could articulate that in a way that was non-medical, but gave clients permission to do that. Because to your point, like copyright, the NDA is the enemy of good business. They should dish. They should open. They should completely let the floodgates flow and trust that that is going to allow the consultant to do their job even better. How do you play with that emotional dynamic with your clients?
There's always a moment where sometimes I will explicitly say, I did it this morning. I was like, oh gosh, you're new in your role. This is really difficult. I understand, like, empathy, basic empathy. I don't even know how to dress it up. Basic empathy. I understand where you're coming from. I'm telling you my positionality. Now I'm going to step out of mine and try and step into yours and ask you, did I get that? Does that feel right? Does that make sense? Is there anything that I'm missing? To literally just try and see things from their perspective for a minute. And then I will explicitly say, when some people are nervous, did this yesterday, like, damn, I'm a consultant that like comes and gets paid to like be here when you're worried that I'm doing your job, aren't you? And people are like, yeah. I'm like, well, here's the thing. I say this all the time. I'm like, I don't know marketing. I don't know brand. I don't know fashion. I don't know styling. I don't know tech. I don't know anything really, but I'm really shit hot at like research and insight and like understanding how to disseminate that amongst people so it feels like theirs. So I'm gonna reassure you that like I'm not a threat to you. I'm in partnership with you.
And that is an excellent strategy, right? Of empathy and humility. But I still feel that there's some, and I haven't had success with this myself, but I still feel that there's a permission piece that we can't give beforehand, because if we give it beforehand, it's like jinxing it. They're not going to do it. But there is that trigger in which okay, the floodgates are ready to be open. And so empathy and humility is the nurturing, prerequisite, the ingredients that make it happen. But I think we're onto something which gets to that flipped mercenary, right? Where we're approaching the organization with a radically different philosophy, right? Methodology than consultants, right? Or even researchers who, have some issues with the way in which historically they've approached this shit.
Completely agree. It gets easier the further along the process you are. The start, I think I spend a lot of time, probably more time than I should, of like, this is how it will feel. This is how it might look. Like, can I have access to your office to just like pull up and work there? Like, I'm not saying why, but I'm like, it just like makes sense. And then I can do like drop-in interviews as and when. But I'm like, my head's on swivel and I'm listening with all senses, because what people say and what they do is like all of us drastically different. But I think we can learn something from like performance artists in this space as well, where it's like one of the most successful presentations or like insight anthropology kind of like disseminations that I've done was where it was a while ago, and a company was looking to speak to women of color, and I've explained why that is not going to work as a strategy first and foremost, or as like a language or a lexicon. But you can, again, this is academics speaking to academics, and I'm not an academic at all, but like people on the inside speaking to each other is really easy. But I'm like, no, that's the brief. It's not tell us about 120 like women of color from around the world. It's like, no, how the actual brief is, how do I get these people that make decisions every single day to understand that women of color does not make sense as a concept, a term, a label. Like, it's highly offensive and actually just bad for business as well. So the way to do that was, so I presented the work referring to everyone, and of course, like at that level, everyone in the room was like a white woman or like a white man, apart from like a few people dotted around the room. So I had allies that I told like I was going to do this style of presentation with, and they were on board. So I had people that were like, we had a little group that knew what was happening. So in the presentation, I referred to all of the women that I spoke to as women of color, and I spoke to all of the people in the room as like people of no color. So I'm like, you have a position too. Again, this neutrality. I'm like, you don't get to be nothing. No way. So, and you'd see the bristling It's like almost like you have to like play with it. I'm like, oh my God, this is such a funny situation to be in,
Yeah.
where there are two black women who are talking about women of color in a room with basically exclusively white men. Like, this could
Yeah.
be tragic or it could be really useful. And
Yeah.
like, what are the small tools that make people feel the insight as opposed to like read it in a 2D manner? So people started bristling, and it took one person to be like, hey, I just find that term really offensive, to open the floodgates, where it's like, oh yeah,
Yes.
you probably
Yes.
felt really othered. Your blood was probably boiling unintentionally. That's what you've been doing for the last 10 years in this way, this way, this way. I'm going to
Yeah.
continue my presentation. So I think there's so much that we can learn from like artists who naturally take this
Well,
kind of,
and to your point, what artists do is recognize that their work is primarily emotional.
yeah,
And even fucking advertisers forget that, and that is the basis of their whole industry.
it's
And
crazy.
and this is for my own where my head's been at lately. I find, and I have become a bit of a hammer looking for a nail, that I am now obsessed with the role of emotion in the corporate workplace. But it strikes me that the higher up you go in the hierarchy, the more that they expect other people to deal with their emotions rather than they deal with their emotions themselves. And that's part of what makes the situations you describe both an opportunity to make change, but also a lot of work. Like, this is where you're now a social worker too, because you're dealing with their emotions and you got to navigate their emotions. And not everyone I think is ready to do that kind of work or has been trained or prepared to do that kind of work. But
Yeah,
to
yeah.
segue to our kind of point to my where I want to talk to you about America. America right now is a war of words, because often the words we use are felt differently and heard differently than other people. And to your point about navigating, of trying to help people understand that women of color is a phrase that they don't really want to be using. It's not in their incentive. It is part of that linguistic negotiation. And you did it yourself just a little early when you're like, oh, I'm not an academic. And I say that all the time, so I totally get where you're coming from. But, Tamika, I have to tell you, you are academic adjacent. And you're academic adjacent because people are just going to look at you, listen to you, hear the words you see, and go, oh, I don't know. You sound a little academic. And that's where, on the one hand, you're rejecting all the bullshit academia, all the corruption, all the nonsense. But on a certain point, we should, on a humble level, acknowledge we are appropriating academia for our own purposes. And that it's the same way that the trespasser phrase is such a great trespasser. We need to come with a better phrase that acknowledges how we are, ripping off some of the academic culture, but at the same time, giving it the big fuck you. And it's like the consultant flip. There's got to be something to play with there. I don't know what it is. I'm raising the challenge generally, but you get
Gosh,
where I'm going with this.
I love this so much. And I feel like, yes, Jesse, this format is really great. There is a framework that I'm obsessed with at the moment, and I'm not usually obsessed with frameworks, by the Berkana Institute, who deal with organizational like culture and change. And I don't want to bastardize it. It's on YouTube. It's great. But it's about what happens when there's like an old world that is dying, that is being propped up by people that have all of the incentives to keep the status quo. And then when there's like a new one being reborn, what kind of happens in that in between? And it shows the different roles that people play, which is what I'm most interested in, like the pioneers, the kind of stabilizers of the old world, the composters, which is the role that I think I'm playing right now, which is like, how do you take what you see as being like maybe slightly archaic, like out of step, because there's good stuff there. There's good stuff in the old dying world that like, I'm like, okay, let me trespass over there and see what you've got going on. And then flip it exactly, like appropriate it to make sense for whatever the emergent thing is. And it's such a beautiful framework. And I think it's also really dangerous if you don't put yourself in someone else's shoes looking at that framework, because I think it could be really easy. I did a little community session about like creative tensions, like at the end of last year, and someone came up to me and was like, "Oh my god, this is what's happening in like America right now, you know, like the old world is dying, and like us, like the people who are like, you know, radical and like mutual aid and like care about like, you know, working class in the emerging world." And I was like, the way that someone who is like deeply conservative and like on the Trumpian stage looks at this exact framework and sees the status quo as being, you know, who we are, government, like all of those things, and sees that they're creating an emergent world. They're just doing the inverse as to the way that we see it. And I think it's a useful framework, but I think it can be slightly dangerous if you don't also try it on for size through other people's point of view, because it can just be like self-fulfilling. But exactly to your point, like the idea of a composter who is like, what have they got going on over there that I don't wholeheartedly like believe in, but I can take and appropriate to make sense for the futures that I want to kind of propagate.
Yeah, and that's a brilliant way of allowing me to talk about why the "okay boomer" phrase is so dangerous. Yeah. You know, on the one hand, I love when young people rebel against their elders, rebel against convention, you know, and there's a lot of truth to that kind of sentiment. But dehumanizing an entire generation that also happens to be wealthy, that also happens to vote, that also happens to have the political power that they do. And it is, not everyone wants to talk about this, but the boomers are a big part of Trump's power base. And these were countercultural kids in the 60s who became yuppies in the 80s. And, you know, we sort of dismiss this stuff, but I say this because I, in my naive, small d democratic way, think about how do we win them back, right? Like, how do we, you know, the modern medicine is what it is. They're not dying anywhere. They're going to have their wealth. They're going to have their votes. We need to get them back to maybe where they were as youth. To your point, they are anti-establishment. Right now, they potentially see medicine as the establishment or democracy as the establishment. Right. And that might be misguided, but I get it. I understand. And rather than dismiss them, rather than dehumanize them, how do we create a culture in which, rather than be alienated, they come back? And allow me to segue that, still under the America theme, to something else that I listened to a podcast this morning, and the podcast made this rather interesting observation of American culture, which, you know, in American culture, identity is paradoxical, because on the one hand, race is seen as incredibly rigid, right? That there is no escaping your race is kind of the American idea. And right now, conservatives are freaking out because they think that gender is rigid, right? And that no way should someone be able to have flexible gender. But yet the core of the American dream, as fucked up as it is that class is not rigid. Right? In Britain, class is rigid. In Britain, the idea of class is very fucking rigid. But in America, the myth all along has been that class is the most fluid identity. And the idea being that poor people should vote for the interests of rich people because they one day will be rich. And that is part of the logic of the MAGA movement. And I'm trying to wrap my head around this kind of paradox, is contradiction, because 100% I believe that gender is fluid and that people, but his argument was that the people who are proponents of gender fluidity have fallen prey to their opponents' arguments, because rather than them say that gender is fluid, they are now using the language of "we were born this way." When instead what they should be arguing is anyone at any time can switch sides. That if you feel like changing your mind, cool, do whatever you want. And so I feel that this is one of the tensions right now in Trump's America, is they are trying to dehumanize immigrants. They are trying to dehumanize trans folks. They are trying to dehumanize people who are flexible about identity where they can't be flexible. They want to impose rigid identity in some cases, but not in others. right?
That is
And it is this
so
weird kind of contradiction that again got my head thinking. So I'm throwing it to you, Tamika, because as my favorite anthropologist, I'm sure you got some crazy thoughts on this.
I love this so much. I've never thought about it that simply. Like, that is the thing that, you know, when I say I'm from a working class background, everyone in Britain who was born into a working class background is incredibly proud of it.
Yeah.
No matter how much you kind of, you know, you start to, here's the thing, it's so simple in Britain. Like, you are working class if you live paycheck to paycheck and you don't have any investments in order to pay your bills. Like, that's just it. Like, so that is the majority of us.
Yeah, it's inclusive.
It's super inclusive. The pool is massive. And also, it's an identity that people are very, very, like, you hold on to it so tightly, no matter if it's even not true. And you start to pick that apart and you're like, wait, but don't you have like a friggin' holiday home in the south of France? Like, what's happening?
A lot of British entertainers are guilty of that, right? Because their
Girl.
entire career and identity is based on that working class identity, but their success, unfortunately, has meant that they have upward mobility. But your point is very valid. It is a source of pride, right? A real source of pride.
Without a doubt. But all of the backflips that I've had to, this is the biggest thing, the backflips that I've had to do when I come to America, because class is, we talk about it all the time in the UK. We talk about class all the time. Race, not so much. It's starting to change now, whereas it's the opposite here. So I felt that very acutely when I first moved here. I was like, ooh, something's different. But you have to do backflips here. Like, people will be like, oh, I earned 3% more than the medium. So, bitch, you are working class. Like, what the hell? This is insane. Like, so I was sitting in Georgia doing some ethnographic research in August, September, and I was listening to Kamala and Donald talk, whatever the hell that was, be in dialogue with it. I don't know what it was. And the gut punch for me was like, there's a predictability that comes with what Donald is going to say that is like easy to kind of disseminate. It was really difficult for me to hear Kamala talk, and I don't usually post on Instagram that much, but I was 3 Negronis down. So I was like, no, like, I was like, do you know what? Actually, fuck the middle class. And I said it out loud, and the amount, I don't usually get this much interaction. The amount of interaction I had from like friends here being like, what do you mean? I'm middle class. And I'm like, unless I've got something drastically wrong, you're definitely not. Like, you have to look at the most like othered, vulnerable, like purposefully
to your point about
out of power.
To your point about paycheck to paycheck, in America, the frame which people should be recognizing is they're way closer to being homeless than they are to being a billionaire.
Same with disability. I'm like, we're all kind of just temporarily abled. Everything's on this spectrum where, again, it's like this weird constipation with the I'm this or I'm that, or I'm not this or I'm not that. And I, again, as a like mixed race Black woman, like, very often, oh my God, so I just did this run. It was a 5K run in January, and when I'm on Tinternet, don't know if you've heard of it, the www. Whenever I'm doing forms, I don't, depending on what I think the form is being used for, I usually don't put my race and my gender or my age. And I ran a 5K race with 2 of my friends. And at the end of the race, my friend messaged me and was like, Tamika, you are in the top finishers for this 5K. I'm not a runner. So, like, I run, but I'm not a runner.
Yeah.
I was like, I was in Corral C. Like, there's no way that happened. I went on the leaderboard and I forget that sports, like, I'm not a sports person. I'm a dancer. So I'm like, oh yeah, like, people put things in like quantification. So I've been categorized as like a gender fluid runner, which I kind of like. I'm like,
why not?
Man. Yeah, sure. So, like, I got this trophy through to my house saying that I was like the first place 5K runner, and had this maelstrom of like emotion where I was like, no, I do feel that way. When I say like any and all pronouns, I genuinely mean it, because also I'm being very serious about like what's happening to gender fluid, non-binary and trans folk right now. I've been working with the Trans Oral History Project a little
Right
bit
on.
over the last few weeks, which has been amazing. And this is also the thing, I just get in line where people know what they're doing and how to organize, and like I'm like, I will do whatever you need me to do, just
Yeah.
put me in place.
Although
But
I will point out that that is the privilege of New York City, that it collects a lot of people who know what they're doing. The rest of us in the hinterland, we're all figuring it out on our own. It's a whole lot messier, I'll tell you that much. But please continue.
no, it's so fair and it's so real, and I forget that sometimes. I do. And it was a very open dialogue between Amara Jones and like a couple of other people that are working on Transa, Red Heart, Trans Oral History Project, and they were saying that the art that they like partake in. Sorry, I'm going all about the
No,
shop here.
no, you're
The
rocking.
art that they partake in at the moment is like, a lot of it is like musical, and it deals with archives and like how to turn those archives into works of art and music that people can respond to and be in space with other people. This is also, I think, an antidote to some of this like okay boomer shit, where it's like intergenerational exchanges in physical spaces. I
Yes.
think are the
Yes.
antidote to like a lot. Like if you
Yeah.
have a intentional and thoughtful process, I think we can all learn so much from each other. We don't have to start from scratch all over again. So I think they're doing incredible work. But they were saying that there's like a young, like white heterosexual man that's been working with them, and he's been quiet for the last year. And then out of the blue, he came out with this piece of work that he played for Amara, and she was like, this is incredible. We thought you were just like asleep in the corner for the last year. But this guy's like, no, I've been really absorbing and listening to like, what, your community is kind of dealing with and going through at the moment. And they all said it really clearly. They were like, there's some funky shit that is about to happen in the next 3 years. It is your job to get funkier.
Yeah.
Get funkier. Like,
Yeah.
understand, like, to your point, like where soft power kind of like lies. Understand how you can like form communities of like practice and nourishment. Like, it's
Well,
so clear.
and I think in answering the kind of challenge as brilliantly as you did, as spontaneously as you did, you offered indirectly a really powerful answer, which goes back to where we started with anthropology, that you have to position yourself, right? That the anthropologist can't come in and start labeling people. The anthropologist has to come in and start listening to people to understand what they're talking about. And part of the fascist nature of this political moment in America is the external enforcement of identity. You are
Yeah.
legal and you are not, right? You are this gender, not this gender. And what we need is a situation in which identity, self-determination, is actual self-determination. That people, within reason, because I'm still fine with banning Nazis and punching Nazis, and like there's limits to that. But I do think that we have to get to a world in which, rather than identity be this rigid concept, people are allowed to explore themselves through that fluidity. That's where
Agree.
our trans comrades and our disabled comrades are leading the way, because they are, very much developing these types of inclusive communities and inclusive identities. But I want to, in trying to bring our conversation to an end, because I could go on for hours and hours and hours, let me ask you the question that is kind of similar to how I started this when I did with anthropology. How has your view of ancestors or of ancestry or of kin relations evolved as you've been doing the Dial-an-Ancestor project, which you did talk about the project a little earlier in terms of alluding to it. You're more than welcome to get into more description now. But in particular, I'm always interested in how Tamika's changing, because that's part of why I love you so much, is you are the kind of person who, there's the future is not evenly distributed. There's the nothing's inevitable provided we're willing to pay attention. And the other MetaViews phrase that we say repeatedly on this show is those not busy being born are busy dying. And it speaks to how we constantly are reinventing and renewing ourselves. So how has your thoughts on ancestry, your relationship with ancestry evolved as you've been, I don't want to say curating, facilitating this phenomenal participatory project?
Oh, thank you so much, Jesse. I want to get those 3 tenets like written down and stuck up on a wall somewhere. It's amazing. So Dial-an-Ancestor is a hotline that is publicly accessible 24/7. It's really simple. You call a number. I should know the number off by heart. I'll do it later.
Although Google Dial-an-Ancestor and the number will be made available to you. And as you say that, I've been so enthralled with our conversation that I've been forgetting some of the showbiz elements that I do as part of the show. Like normally I bring up like the guest website, for example. And in this case, I thought, I'll bring this up first. And then later I'll bring up the Dial-an-Ancestor. So,
thanks, Jesse. There's the number. So it's really simple. You call the number, you press 1 to listen to an ancestor, and you press 2 to speak as an ancestor. Really, this could be called anything. It could be called dialer, human, dialer, whatever. It's so interchangeable. But quite understandably, when I say dial an ancestor, there are several responses that are all perfectly logical. Ancestry is in the past. It's like dead people. What I'm asking people to do here is to play with their relationship to time. And we think ancestry in the past. I'm asking people to think ancestry in the present and eventually the future. So there's some people that have left messages that are no longer on this earthly realm. And there are other people that are walking around alive, and it's kind of an existential trigger to think about who you are and who you've become, who maybe you shouldn't have become, and who you might want to be. It's very, very open-ended. And I listen to the voice recordings that come through like every Sunday or every other Sunday. And in the pandemic, where people had the luxury of kind of like time and insularity and, not having pendulums swung back to this insane kind of corporate land that everyone seems to have just entered back into. People were far more introspective and quite philosophical with the messages that they were leaving. As time has gone on, we like things that are new and that are novel. It's been around for like 3.5 years and it doesn't exist on Instagram. There's no like quantifiable data that comes with Dial-an-Ancestor quite purposefully. And I didn't want a social media account attached to it. So I basically wheat paste in order to get the word out. I live in Brooklyn, so there's only so far that I can go, but kind of word has traveled a little bit more. But there are fewer and further between recordings, which is like absolutely fine. It's okay. But I think it surprises people when I say that the archive actually, like the physical like archive that exists like on this hard drive, it's not much more like complicated than that, is of less importance to me than the somatic experience that someone is going through when they understand that they are a worthy and needed and necessary and vital human being who also has the propensity to leave something behind, but also like shape the future. It's quite powerful. So I say that the body is the real archive, and it's the only archive that we really have. And I'm really interested in facilitating some more kind of experiences that are intergenerational and that are in physical space around this idea, because it's one thing to be on your phone by yourself in your bedroom, kind of doing quite an introspective thing. But I think I want to expand like the we element of Dial-an-Ancestor. And also I want to get some recordings through that I fundamentally disagree with.
Right on. I would say that's a challenge in framing, a worthy challenge in framing, because I think to the point of being a philosopher provocateur, that would be a very worthwhile experience. I would point out as a kind of design element that what you've created is a kind of ceremony, right? That you're encouraging people to engage in this ceremony, and that I love the idea of an intergenerational or a group configuration. But I would argue it's a different ceremony. And
It
to
is.
think about how the ceremony should be structured to facilitate that. But you did, in a way, kind of dodge the question, or at least you obliquely, which is, how has your thoughts on the concept of the ancestor evolved? Or maybe it hasn't. But I get the sense that it may have, that, you know, your
Really?
concept has become more, I don't want to say 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional, 5-dimensional, that, you know, perhaps, and this is why you desire the upsetting, the dissenting, the alternative narrative that hasn't manifest, because you want more honesty, you want more humanity in this ceremony and this practice of evoking ancestry, of ancestors.
I love this idea of ceremony, and I think there's so much of like ritual is just the like offline version of an algorithm. Like we also have
Yeah.
the ability to do that through ritual and ceremony, and so many of us don't have it. And to have that kind of time-based like thread is so important. But I'll tell a story about maybe where I think like I'm itching to move towards. I did my first artist in residence like last year for 3 weeks, which was mind blowing to me. I thought I was doing it wrong for like the first 50% of the time, because I was like, what the hell? Like, where's the trick? Like, I'm just here and you're allowing me to do my thing. Like, what? It was insane.
Was this before or after you came up with the phrase trespassing?
It was at the time.
There you
It was
go.
at the time because I was in, or again, like in the middle of the forest in Oregon, and in the induction, they went through like how to like hike and how to navigate the snow and how to build a fire and all of these things. I've got so many stories, but I'm not going to tell you all of them. And in our immediate gathering, the person that was kind of hosting us and responsible for our cohort, there was a gunshot in the background, and he was like, "Oh, if you hear that, don't worry about it. It's like further away than it actually sounds." Like there was this weird like perception, like reality thing, but also like he brushed it off really quickly. I was like, "Nah, bro,
America.
there's America." I was like, "Nah, bro, I do not hear gunshots. Like, what the heck? What are you talking about?" And he was saying that there's a family that live on the outskirts of the property that own like a big property, and they shoot. And I was like, "Oh, what's that family's name?" Just like off cut. So obviously I spent the next like 3 days understanding the land that I was on and how it had come to be. And what is it called? Like the colonized, like railway colonization system that
Eminent
happens, like, in
domain?
Oregon. Maybe.
Like where they
And
stole the land for the railway.
exactly.
Yeah,
And then
eminent domain.
and then I learned about manifest destiny.
Yeah.
So having all of this time to trespass and think about how to like bastardize the concept of time meant that I can understand the dog whistles really quickly, and this is the language thing around what's going on right now. So I started thinking about ancestry in a different way through several different lenses, but one of them that was more personal. I go to a like energy healer who does like psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, and hypnosis. I was like, I've got time now. Like, let's get a session in. And she asked point blank, she's like, we've done a lot of talking. She was like, are you ready for the colonized part of yourself to talk to the decolonized part of yourself? I was like, what do you mean? Don't tell me that. But also,
I
like,
might have just been like, no, not there yet.
no. I was like, yes. And here's the thing. I remember vividly being 15 years old in high school, and Angela Jabbar in our chemistry class turning to me and being like, rah, like, quite literally, your mum's people, like, probably colonized your dad's. Like, Liverpool, Port, you know, like, literally, Gold Coast, Ghana, like, Elmina, like, the route is, like, A to B.
Yeah. This isn't
Probably,
metaphor. This is actual geography and history.
and it lives inside me. Back to the body is the archive, and like that's what the ancestry is really complicated. Like I think being in America specifically, understandably, like there's a lot of blackness is really complex.
Yes.
Blackness is really complex, and I understand like the need and the necessity and the desire to like trace histories back as far as you can, and it can be painful and it can be exhilarating and it can help you understand like who you are and how you move through the world. But it's like, again, it's so nuanced, where there's usually a part if you're tracing a family tree that you get to somewhere that you don't want to be. You don't want to be there.
Yeah.
And like it's I don't know, like it feels quite like, even though like 23andMe and like the ancestry.com, all of this is like op movement. Like, I'm just, no, what are you using this shit for?
I'm glad you went there, because you reminded me, and I got to be vague in terms of how I disclose this, but in my corporate travels, was in a position to see a brief from ancestry.com because almost all of their clients are white people, like overwhelmingly.
Stop.
Not at all. And, you know, as I'm sure you understand the language of advertising, marketing, and communications, they were looking for people of color, and they were trying to figure out, you know, how exactly they could diversify their data set, because that's fundamentally, as a company, what their business is. They don't give a fuck who you're related to. They need a genetic data set that is diverse as possible. And it turns out it's only white people who are going, who am I? Where am I from? Who are my ancestors? Versus all non-white people. They know where they're from, right? And I say this because the other thing that I've been thinking about, to go back to our conversation on the flexibility of identity, is I'm old enough to remember how the definition of white in America has changed, and changed radically, right? For a long time, it didn't include Cuban people. Now it almost sort of does. It definitely didn't include Italians and Jews, but it sure does now. And the Jewish part is very much the colonialism of Palestinians, right? That in going from Jews as being not white to Jews as being white was very much part of the alliance between America and Israel, right? And, and the way that plays out. You know, the Italian piece, I'm not Italian, so I can't really comment to that, but I suspect it has a lot to do with the way that organized crime was essentially fought. Because in the early days of fighting organized crimes, Italians were definitely not white, right? The same way that Irish were not white for a very long time. And that part of American history is lost on people. The same way, to your point, the Black American identity is incredibly complex because it's geographically dependent. Right? There is no unified Black American identity, as much as American culture might want to make it that way, right? Brooklyn is completely different than Georgia, which is completely different than Texas, which is completely different than anywhere else, right? And that nuance, white America acknowledges that. White America gets into blue state and red state, and, you know, middle America versus coastal America. So this is the contradictions and the paradoxes of kind of America in its current existential angst.
For sure. And then it goes back to like those three very simple, like gender, race, class. And it's like those things are so inextricably linked, but like who gets to benefit from it, and then whose stories get like shoved, you know, beneath the carpet. Like Black American labor made this. I mean, they weren't even Black American at the time. It was, you know, African peoples who made
America,
this country, the money, the wealth, like all of it, and then were made to be Black. You know, like it's all so tied up within each other. And I think that's why I'm like so geeking out on like, I didn't use YouTube until about 5 years ago. Don't know what, I don't know, it just missed me. But I am like obsessed. Like Al Jazeera, the struggle for Africa, and want to understand about the Cold War. I want to understand about like Ukraine and like how we've gotten to the place that we've gotten to now by like backtracking in a way that feels like robust and useful. But yeah, the ancestry part is like, if our body is the archive and that is the only thing that we have that separates, like, there's so much that we inherit that we don't understand where it comes from. Like, there's only so much that people can say on this little hard drive that is going to transmit to like the next generation. It's not going to change too much, but on a like day-to-day basis, like it triggers something in people. But the body is the thing that really does, and you inherit so much of that. And I think the more that you can overlay kind of like historical movement and stories and like ideas with like thematic understanding of like the body that you inhabit, the more useful that's going to be for future generations, because, and again, context.
And this is where I think you and I kind of vibe as researchers, as, you know, academic adjacent, is my rejection of academia. My part of the core reason that I feel that academia is one of the core engines of colonialization is the desire to record and archive everything. Versus I am much more of an oral culture in which my brain, my body is what is absorbing this stuff. That's why I have dope conversations with dope people, because I don't need to reference some book. It's all coming from my intuition. It's all coming from, and the more I talk to people, the more it passes on. This is why I fundamentally agree with you. Intergenerational exchanges and culture and living is our antidote to this rising fascism. It's the antidote to the insanity and the anxiety that is taking hold of our culture and our public. But I think there is a need to have anthropologists, to have researchers, to have powerful people not writing shit down.
Agree
with
you.
And creating, to the point of constipation, just throw shit out there, right? Get it out there. There's lots of ways in which the oral can be performed in the digital. And, you know, I was thinking this morning, rather selfishly, that the biggest impact Dial-an-Ancestor has had on me is I love creating content. I love creating podcasts. I hate promoting them. So my attitude is I'm doing this for my ancestors. Let them find it. Right?
I love
you know,
it.
And that way it's just out there. That. And to your point, the knowledge I get from phenomenal conversations like we're having right now is in my body.
100%.
Right? And like, that is where the, you know, Harriet is coming here to confer, right? Harriet agrees.
Exactly,
yes,
Harriet.
It's in the body.
Exactly. We need some like non-human voices on that archive too, Harriet.
Yes,
so whenever you're ready.
Point taken, I'll do that. Yes. Once it gets a little warmer, once the snow melts a bit, then yes, absolutely, I'll follow through on that.
But yes, I love that so much, and it's quite a paradoxical thing to say to people. I'm like, yeah, like, you know, people be like, oh, this is my great grandma's like peach cobbler recipe. I'm like, are you sure? Are you sure you want to put that on like a public archive? Like, I don't know. Maybe that's not for. Maybe that's sacred, and that's for like you and like your body and your chosen family. I don't know, like maybe think twice about those things. Also, it comes down to like status, right? And power. This is also the shadow side of it. You document the thing, you put your name on it, you have ownership over it, like, because I mean there's IP. That's also the other thing about like indentured servants and slavery, like yes, bodies and like labor, but also like IP, man. God damn. Like so I understand where some of the like impulse to like over document comes from, but there's also such a thing as like you are so ungovernable if there are some things that you have for yourself and you keep sacred.
And to that point, and this is where fascism is through its own contradictions rising to power. The primary governance of our world, of YouTube, of knowledge, of all the things we have had, has been copyright.
Yep.
right? Like the stuff you can see on YouTube and the stuff you can't see on YouTube has to do with copyright. And that is
Yep.
a weird kind of knowledge bias that I would love to get past. But getting past that, of course, is a whole other conversation and a whole other challenge. And I am conscious that we are taking up a lot of your time. And I would love to have you back
I'd love
as
that.
a recurring guest here on the podcast. But one last question before I sort of throw to our shout outs. What's the vibe in Brooklyn these days vis-a-vis the larger American political situation? I ask this because I wrote an issue of my newsletter about Boston, because Boston is really getting a kind of insubordinate, rebellious kind of culture that is flaring. You know, Brooklyn in particular has always had a very proud, a very defiant, a very independent culture. So I would love to hear from a Brooklynite, what's the vibe? What is the feeling there when it comes to the current political situation? Because the paradox is, you know, you are on the periphery as someone who wasn't born in America, but then you're also on the periphery because Brooklyn is kind of on the periphery of America.
100%.
So give me and our listeners a sense of what it's like there right now.
I'm going to give you a sense of who our mayor is, Eric Adams, a former cop,
A Trumpian in his own right.
a Philly Trumpian, without a doubt, who is more likely to be found in the club popping champagne on a Friday night than anywhere else. So like that is that's the person that's in charge here. But I think that the counteraction of that is like, I think there is a mass understanding that like Democrat land ain't working, and that they're trading in concepts and fluffy ideas as opposed to like concrete actionable points. I mean, that's the thing. You went on Trump's website and you went on Kamala, and I understand there were different kind of dynamics that they and processes and timelines that they had, but let's just call it as it is. Trump was saying very concrete, understandable things that everyone could get on board with. I think Kamala was and the left were kind of running off of identity politics that are so done, like to everything that we've talked about today.
And you're British, so I can say this without upsetting you. That wasn't the left, that was the center.
Yeah, for sure. Without a doubt.
Yeah,
like, without a doubt. And I think people, at least the circles that I run in here, know that the only thing that we have is each other right now. So, like, mutual aid and, like, grassroots movement is the only thing that we can rely on right now. So it feels like there's, like, a maybe... Yeah, now, I've only been here 4 years, but now more than ever in those last 4 years, there's a real willingness to, like, boots on the ground, find the ecosystem of change and know the role that you play really well. That is very like, I have fresh food. I am going to put the food in the community fridge. Like, the revolution ain't coming with a 501c status, babe. Like, it's not happening. So, let's.
Well, I had another guest on the show who organized. I sent you the event, I think, Fugitive Futures. And I thought that was such a great phrase, that we're not going to do this within the system, right? Like we got to be outlaws. We got to be fugitives. One of the things we've been getting into in the newsletter that I'd love to talk to you about some point in the future, because as a Brit, I think unlike Americans, you'd actually be able to discuss it intelligently. I think what we're witnessing is the death of liberalism. That the center is collapsing. And unfortunately, it's the far right who have seized the day, who, to your point, are speaking to the working class, who are speaking to the material reality of people's struggles. And we need the liberals to get the fuck out of the way. We need the center to collapse so that the left can come back to its historical role of opposing fascism, of opposing capitalism, and providing alternatives for the people. Again, that's been my kind of research focus on a philosophy, on an ideological level, in addition to the cultural work that really motivates me and drives me. So I'd love to have you back to kind of get into that, because I think as an anthropologist, you'd have really a lot of interesting things to say. The other thing I'm going to flag now that we're at the end and I'm bringing up my wish list of future topics to discuss with Tamika, I've also been working, big picture, I'm fully now an abolitionist in the sense of fuck prisons, fuck police. We need to close that shit. And I think the reason it took me so long to get to that position is I needed the answer before I could commit. And to me, the answer is a radical empowerment and scaling up of social work. That we use social work as a kind of frame to address the things that criminology would focus on and that law and order would focus on.
That's interesting.
Again, I haven't written about it yet because it's still something that's working in my head, but I'm floating the idea to you so that when the next time we talk, we'll see how those things percolate and interconnect.
I love this. My friends just had...
Sorry, 1 second. I got to let this pass. I want to make sure that you're heard. Go ahead, because now you when the thing was on, your mic wouldn't have heard. Go ahead.
Sorry, all good. I love that train of thought and would love to be back to discuss this with you. A friend has just rejected like a quite substantial grant to make art inside a prison in New York for several reasons, and she's deeply abolitionist. So we have interesting conversations. Would love to talk to this about this with you. Maybe bring her as well.
I was going to say, if you wouldn't mind saying a good word to her and saying, hey, my friend Jesse has a podcast. He'd love to have you as a guest. I can give you her info because he's just turning on to the abolition movement and would love to learn more and promote more.
For sure. I absolutely will. Jesse, I have to run because I have to get on the MTA.
So our last segment, real quick, is a shout out. You kind of just did it, but is there any one thing, person, concept, place that you would like to shout out in our last moment here in the show?
Yes. Oh God, there's so many.
And while you think, I will send you the 3 sayings that I repeated here on the show, and I will actually give you the intellectuals who are responsible for them rather than just rip them off as the thief that I am. And I'll also resend you the calendar link so that you can put yourself in again for another session. And at some point, we got to talk about you having a podcast, because I would listen to that fucking podcast every single day the moment that those episodes dropped. With all that delay, shout out anyone, thing, person, fictional, real, dead, living that you think our audience should be paying attention to.
Go Google American artists. That is their legal name that they have, that they go by now. They do a lot of work using... Octavia Butler's kind of archives and ideas on what the future is. Parable of the Sower, like, ultimately changed the way that they think about their work. I don't know them personally, but I've loved seeing what they're doing.
Those are the best shout-outs, guaranteed. And I actually was part of a dystopian reading group at the start of the pandemic, which obviously included Parable of a Sower and others. And it really bothers me how prophetic all that shit was. But I think with more conversations like this, the dystopia is coming to an end. Our last episode was called The Last Gasp of Authoritarianism. I suspect this one might be about trespassing. I never actually titled the episodes until I listened to them again and kind of allow them to percolate. But thank you, Tamika. This has been fantastic. Tamika can be found at cornerbooth.work and Dial-an-Ancestor. We will have those URLs in the show notes. MetaViews available on all platforms everywhere. This has been the best episode yet. Does mean our next episode might suck. Manage your expectations, folks. But we'll be back soon. Thanks again.